Washington County.
Allison Frazier, Chittenden County.
Brad Ferlin, Caledonia County.
Martin Van Buren, Rutland County.
Michael Colson, Essex County.
Nick Burnham, Windsor County.
Jamie Dragon, Lamoille County.
Michael Bancroft, Orange County.
David Dean, Wyndham County.
Okay, Commissioner, you want to?
Good evening. I'm Christopher Herrick, Commissioner of the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And we have half of the staff is here today. We start with Josh, maybe, and then work down.
I'm Josh Horse. I'm an officer.
Yes, General Counsel. Margaret Markey, Fish Program Manager.
David Salisville, Program Manager with Wildlife Management. Tom Fowler, Major for the Warden Service.
Chris Bernie, wildlife biologist. Then on the screen, Eric.
Yeah, hey everyone. Eric Palmer. I'm the Fish Division Director.
Good evening, Mark Scott, Director of Wildlife.
Okay. Can you guys hear us okay on this, on your end?
I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can actually hear you guys really well. All of your side conversations are now very audible when you're starting the meeting.
You're welcome.
Excellent.
Spread a little fear and loathing, why don't you, Eric?
It's a great improvement over previous meetings for sure. The audio is great.
Great. Okay, so our first item on the agenda is the approval of the meeting minutes from April 26th. Everybody's had a chance to take a look at those.
Make a motion to approve.
Okay, I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
And I have a second. Okay. Any other discussion on the minutes? If not, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention? Okay, ayes have it. Public comments. This is the point in the meeting where we invite the public to give us their comments on really on anything they want. It's 2 minutes per speaker, and we'll be keeping time up here. So is there anybody who wants to we'll start down there and we'll work this way for anybody, and then we'll go online. If you could just stand up and
Sure.
introduce yourself and where you're from.
So my name is Krista Rose, and I'm actually here for, I'm not from Vermont. I'm a native of New Jersey and New York, but I'm here for a regional initiative. So it's great to be here with you today in person. Again, I'm Krista Rose, and I offered a comment about Eastern puma recovery during the March meeting by phone. So I follow up by #1, just being here with you because I believe so much in face-to-face conversation, even though I'm reading from documents. But I figure that'd be more efficient if I type something up to get in for 2 minutes. But I'm also here to update you on the puma recovery initiative that continues to develop in the Northeast. I am here representing myself only, and you can learn more about me at northeasternpumaproject.net if you care about. But there are a handful of groups that are working for puma recovery that have begun speaking to one another and messaging that to the public. 4 groups were represented at the Northeastern Natural History Conference in Burlington, which is an event that I mentioned during that call in March. 4 of us spoke representing those groups, and importantly, 2 of them have generated peer-reviewed research on habitat suitability and potential corridors for puma recovery. The second event I mentioned was the Symposium on Rewilding North American Species at the Northeastern Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies a few weeks ago in Hershey. The Cougar Research Collaborative gave 4 talks during that symposium. Commissioner Herrick, I'm not sure if you went to that because there were some events for breakout events for directors. So I just wanted to, again, update you guys and be here in person and just draw attention to the fact that some really high level and good quality work is being done exploring puma recovery east of current breeding populations and raising awareness. But for it all to go forward, we need to engage state wildlife agencies, which is why I'm here, and just to meet with you and bring this fresh collective energy to your attention. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, coming this way from, sir?
Hi, Rob Coronado from Orange. I'd like to speak briefly to the traffic rule changes. I hope you all are aware of an incident that occurred on May 2nd when a raccoon was found outside of Island Pond by a motorist with a body gripping trap on its body and head. The motorist took the raccoon and then later dumped it off the side of the road because they were afraid that they were breaking the law. But the thing that I most want to speak to is that this is again an incident where one body gripping trap has killed an animal in a very agreeably unhumane way, and public's finding out about these instances. And so it doesn't matter what the best rules are. I'm worried about the people that don't adhere to them. There wasn't an ID tag on this trap, so again, just like Ann McKenzie's dog, we don't know who's responsible for these horrible instances of illegal trapping. As long as these continue, the public is going to be compelled to push the legislators of the state for more regulations to outlaw all trapping. So I hope that trapping members of the community that are here and listening take note and do their best to try to clean house and make sure that people are adhering to the rules, because according to my research, a third of all licensed trappers are still failing to report their mandatory reports at the end of the year, as required by since 2018. And on average, 30% of all trappers are not filling in the reports. It could be because they don't trap, but we don't know. That's another big discrepancy that shines on a negative light on all trappers. That's all I got to say. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Hello, Commissioner, Board, and members of the department. My name is Bob Galvin, and I live in Richmond. I wanted to start my testimony today by thanking the department fur bear biologist Bree Furphy for taking the time to delve into the issue of rodenticide and fox pits. I and many other wildlife advocates recently read about several baby foxes who likely ingested rodenticide and subsequently died in Middlesex, and appreciate her taking the time to look into the issue in more detail. I also wanted to mention that bear hound training starts a week from tomorrow, and would like to know why Vermont is an outlier compared to surrounding states in terms of how early our start date is compared to theirs. Bear cubs are still tiny and very vulnerable this early in the year, and mother bears are generally not in good body condition either. I'm wondering if the board would consider pushing the start date of bear hound training season back to accommodate both vulnerable bears, including mothers and cubs, and also to be more in line with neighboring states' regulations on the topic of bear hounding. Thank you for your time and have a great evening.
Okay, anybody online, public comments?
So we have one hand from
Sarah, can you hear me all right?
Hi, yes. Can everyone hear me okay?
Go for it.
Okay, thank you. Hello to the board and hello, Commissioner. My name is Sarah Gorsline. I'm calling in from Grand Isle County. And I just wanted to speak briefly about some of the proposed fur bearer rules that are on the department's website. I know there's going to be several open hearings regarding those rules, but I just wanted to make a couple initial comments about those rules. One comment is that the fact that there's no closed season for coyote hunting and that there's no open season for wolf hunting in Vermont, those two facts are in direct opposition to each other. We know that since 1998, there have been several DNA identified wolves killed by hunters in Vermont. I also wanted to point out that given that I work with Project Coyote and their science advisory board, who knows a huge amount about canid science, that it's very easy to mix up eastern coyotes and wolves, animals with significant wolf DNA. As many of you know, eastern coyotes are much larger than western coyotes and tend to have more wolf-like characteristics. So I just wanted to point out that rule in the fur bearer proposed rules does not really make much sense. I also wanted to comment on the item under hound hunting related to coyotes that it states unless a person, that this kind of hound hunting of coyotes is not allowed unless a person is in control of their hunting dogs. I wanted to point out that your own expert biologist who did the extended presentation on radio collaring dogs, he himself noted that over a mile of range, you don't have any contact with those collars. So essentially, you don't have control over dogs outside of the mile range. And if he himself noted that if dogs go over any sort of incline, or if there's any sort of variation of the topography, that those radio collars. Okay, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks to the board.
Thanks, Sarah.
I think that's everyone for online. I'm not seeing any other names.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Moving on, next item on the agenda is the revisions to the bait fish regulations. And Commissioner, I turn over to you and your staff to present that to us.
So you've already voted on this once. So I will turn it over to Director Fisheries, Eric Palmer.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. And I'm going to turn it right over to Margaret Murphy. She's going to make the presentation tonight, and she's been the chair of our baitfish team in developing this proposal.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Commissioner. Hi, all. I do not have a slide. This is easy for you. We do have our bait fish. What?
Yeah, regs themselves.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, for everyone to see it. So the regs were sent out. They have not changed. Just to remind you all, the bait fish regulations are intended to provide fishing opportunities while also reducing the risk of invasive species or diseases. So we're currently proposing minor changes to the regulations that will take effect January 1st of 2024. The 2020 bait fish regulations went through pretty significant changes, so we're allowing people time to get used to those. They seem to like them and don't have any problem with them at this point or major concerns. So there's three minor changes we're looking at. The first one is probably the biggest one, is changing the blacklisted water name to restricted waters, again, to be a little bit more in line with current thinking on some of these terminologies that we use and the potential degrading to certain nationalities. The approved species for use of bait in section 8, there's a 8.1 lists all the species that are allowed. 8.2, 8.3, and 8.4 have additional ones that are allowed, but they're only allowed to be captured by hook and line. So we've added that terminology there. And then the last one is adding, updating the water bodies where the use of bait is prohibited. So we're recommending adding 5 waters and 1 removed, and that's to protect our wild trout fisheries in some of those ponds. Our proposed changes, so we did first vote, we went through ICAR, we had the changes published in newspapers, and we held 2 public meetings, one on May 17th and one on May 18th. The May 17th one was in person. 2 people showed up. They were bait fish shop owners. They really didn't have any comments relevant to these proposed changes. They did have some discussion about their operations that the bait fish team will take under consideration when we review these again. And then we had a virtual one on May 18th. We had 2 people from the public attend. One person was non-responsive, couldn't get any response from them, asking if he could hear us. The other person, I think, was a little bit shocked to have a one-on-one with all of us. He was just curious, trying to, saw the notification about it and was just interested in it, but really didn't have any comments. The public comment period did end on May 19th. We received 2 written comments. One from Rich Langdon, a former DEC employee, who commented on the species list for the Connecticut River, indicating the blunt-nosed minnow is not native and might need to be removed or recommended removed, we will take that under advisement again when we reevaluate the bait fish regulations in whole. And then a second one from a paddler on Lake St. Catherine that noticed some dead bait fish floating that she considered trash, and would we deal with potential bait fish release, which then results in those fish dying, or if it was maybe even a natural event, we're not sure. But again, something that we'll take under advisement, really not relevant to the proposed changes. So the next steps in the process is to go through that second vote today. Once we do that, we will file with LCAR, and then go to the third vote with all of you. And then the final rule will be filed with the Secretary of State for the effective date of January 1st of 2024. So again, we try to get our regulations to go into effect January 1st of that next year. So that's it in a nutshell. Everyone did receive the PDF of the changes in underline and strikeout mode. The underlines were the additions, the strikeouts, the deletion. So happy to entertain any questions that you may have on all of that.
I just have a quick question. Not having been here when these were the last time you addressed the bait fish regulation.
Mm-hmm.
Was that the first time in several years? And I'm sure there's a lot of members here that weren't here also, but was that the first time in several years that you've been those regulations? And I think you're talking about at some point in the near future when you're have like a 5-year period or something along those lines. And finally, how are we doing in terms of what we were trying to achieve with the rewrites approaches?
Right. So I came on also in late 2019. So these were just coming into effect. But we've looked at them about every 4 years is what we've agreed to allow people time to understand the changes. So we reevaluated this round. Our team had some more revisions that we just ran out of time to really get in front of people and get agreement on. So we're going to actually regroup again this summer and review those again. So we might be revising again in 2 years, depending on the outcome of that. But we do commit to doing it at least every 4 years to look at them, reevaluate, see what's working, see where there might be confusion and how it works. And then also, again, looking at what are the disease or invasive species threats that these regulations could help us minimize that risk. And Eric was actually here for the last round and went through it all. I got the results of it. So if there's anything I've missed.
You summarized it pretty well. We made a fair number of changes back in 2008, 9, 10, 12, when VHS was discovered in the Great Lakes, viral hemorrhagic septicemia. Then we kind of let the dust settle, and it was approximately 8 years before we took up the rules again and made the changes 4 years ago. And at that time, we felt 8 years was too long, and we committed to reviewing them at least every 4 years. Not that we'll necessarily make changes every 4 years, but we'll at least open them up for review and discussion. As Margaret said, we had some other ideas that we felt weren't ready to bring to the board this round. So there's a good possibility we'll be back in 2 years instead of 4 with a new baitfish proposal. But our commitment going forward is at least every 4 years we'll review the baitfish regulations.
Anecdotally speaking to some baitfish dealers and anglers that I encountered, the change in the rules last time around, once they saw them, they're like, oh, this makes a lot of sense. It simplified things. And I don't know if the major, the board, they're probably the ones who experience the question more than anybody. Wanted to comment on that.
I agree, Commissioner. It was from the changes that Eric was just talking about back, 12, 15 years ago now, up to the current changes. There's many fishermen that were hugely in favor of the current rules. It made it easier for everybody to understand, and it made sense to me.
Any other questions? Not, and,
Make a motion to approve the bait fish regulation changes as presented by the department.
Second
Second.
okay, any other comments? If not, let's do a roll call, actually. Bancroft,
Yes.
Ryan Bailey,
Yes.
Nicholas Burnham,
Yes.
David Dean,
Yes.
Jamie Dragon,
Yes.
Brad Berlin, yes. Allison Frazier,
Yes.
Al Hogan,
Yes.
Michael Colson,
Yes.
Brian McCarthy,
Yes.
Paul Noel,
Yes.
Robert Patterson,
Yes.
Jay Sweeney,
Yes.
and Frank Fancher. Okay, ayes have it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next item on the agenda is the final vote of the 2003 Angeles deer permits at youth novice season. And I believe
I think,
Nick might do it.
well, I'm not sure next year, so Mark.
Good evening. Nick Fortin will be joining us virtual like I am now, but he's currently at the Moose Regional Workshop. So as soon as he gets free, which I expect to be around 5:30 or so, he'll tune in to answer any specific questions that David or I can't. Want to recognize that David Sosville is in person there tonight. So thanks, David. So to remind the board, we held our 5 public informational hearings as required. Many of the board members attended one or more of those meetings. The last meeting when we gave our proposal in April, we acknowledged we had hearings on the 20th, 23rd, and 24th. And subsequently this month, we held a hearing on the 9th and 17th. The March hearings, as we've witnessed for several years now, were attended more so than the May hearings. We had very light attendance at the May 9th and the May 17th hearing that we had, and virtually all the hearings, we had no opposition that we had heard from people on the number of antlerless permits. We did have a comment here and there that people did not approve of any doe hunting, but those were probably less than 2 or 3, to be honest with you, that we had. The board has seen all the comments that we received on the antlerless deer proposal and on the youth hunting weekend, novice weekend, and archery antlerless hunting. We received no emails on this. It's almost a little scary for someone like me who's lived through the deer wars in the 1980s, where we would have large numbers of people opposed to any antlerless deer hunting in the state. It seems to be a non-issue. Some of the issues we
faded
get,
out.
some of the issues, you still hear me, David?
You've come back now.
Okay, I don't know why. I'll turn my volume up a little more. I hope I'm not too loud for some people. So we heard from a few people up in the northern part of the state, like we would on moose, that they feel some families are getting all the permits, that it's not a true lottery. It really is a lottery, just luck of the draw. Some of those units don't issue a lot of permits, so it's harder to receive an antlerless deer permit to do that. So the proposal we sent to the board is the exact same number of permits that we proposed to you on your initial vote. Tonight, we're asking for the board to officially vote on the final antlerless deer recommendation that we sent to you for each of the WMUs to approve the youth hunting season and novice weekend that we recommended, that they can take a deer of either sex, and to recommend antlerless deer hunting for archery in all of the wildlife management units. Some of the issues that were raised at the hearings went beyond just doe hunting, antlerless deer hunting. They were dealt with the deer rule, whether you can shoot 1 buck, 2 bucks, 4 deer, total bag limit. Do we keep an antler point restriction or not? Those are not the process that we're intending to do that. The department and the board would have to entertain opening up the deer rule, which we actually would be on slate to do in another year from now. The 2015 is when we first, when we, in recent times, made a bunch of changes on our deer management rule. We again went through a 3-year study to collect data on influences of APR and the current regulations. We made substantial changes in 2019. So now this fall, we'll be entering the 5th year with all of the different changes, such as a 1 buck limit, maximum take of deer being 4, which could be 4 antlerless deer if people so choose. We moved the youth weekend a little bit earlier to provide better weather for the youth and the people that their guides that take them out, longer days. So all those things could be back on the table if the department and the board want to next year. Most likely the timing would be early in the year so that you would have time to go through the APA process, through a formal rulemaking process and hold hearings on the changes to do that. That would give us 5 years of collecting data to compare different results among some of the wildlife management units that had the APR lifted. And we tried to pick some that were similar where it was still in place. The unfortunate side for us, we acknowledge it's 5 years, but 2 of those years were under COVID restrictions. And we know from our license sale data and participation rates of hunting, it kind of, we had a real huge uptake in that. But it might have ended up having, higher participation than we normally see. But so that's it. I can happy to answer any questions. I don't know if Nick jumps on. If there's any questions technically that David or I can't answer, we can hold those for Nick.
One quick question. If so 2023 is going to be the 5th year of
Correct.
Collecting data. And so once you complete that data and file that data and analyze it, would your expectation be that any changes wouldn't occur, or would changes occur for the 2024 season or the
Correct.
2025 season?
Could go either way. That would be up to, the department's assessment, the board's assessment. Do we need to make changes or not? And how soon do you want to implement them?
Okay.
That's
So the
following
date
the
would be-
agreement we had with the board. Nothing official legally, nothing binds us to that. But we felt we need at least 5 years.
Okay. Questions for Mark?
There's an omission, I think, for the first time since I've been on the board of the data that breaks down the percentages of the age of the bucks taken. And I would like to see that put back in at the very least, so that we can, looking ahead to a 5-year plan, be able to make those comparisons. In the past, they've been in this report, and this year they were omitted.
Okay.
You could probably issue that too as an addendum.
That data is available in on this report. I think that's just a different report, right? Right, but you would go back.
I didn't hear that comment or
Yeah,
question.
I was
don't-
gonna say, I've lost that conversation.
We'll get it.
Any other questions? Do
Um,
we want? Go ahead, David.
I, between, the sort of lapses in, the program here, and I didn't understand the question about publishing, antlered deer numbers. Was it a matter that they weren't published, or that the data was not generated at all? I just didn't understand that. And I
Sure.
can't hear you.
I think the question was, historically, in the report, we've always received a breakdown by age of the deer that were taken, the bucks that were taken each year. And that is missing in this 2003 or the 2000 data we've been presented as a board. But the issue isn't the data isn't available, it's just it isn't part of the information presented to us. So the commissioners recommended that they just basically issue that separately to us as a board, so we'll have that information.
As an addendum to this report.
Correct.
Thank you.
Mark, I have a quick question for you. If I'm correct, again, I wasn't around when all these rules were being worked on and developed. But one of the, I think, desired outcomes of the rule changes was to, what do I want to say, develop an older class of deer or allow deer to grow age into, age more so, and have hunters be able to take an older class of deer. First of all, is that correct? Secondly, are we working toward that, and are we making progress toward that? Do we know yet how we're doing with that?
Yes, and we're making progress. Nothing is absolute, because of things we can't control. But that was the goal when we first instituted antler point restriction, APR, Brad. So Wayne LaRoche was the commissioner at that time. He was brought in primarily to help manage the deer herd, to be quite frank. And he was a deer biologist himself for a long time, working on it passionately. So that was the move to do that. And it was successful. It protected a lot of yearlings. It was not made to call trophy hunting. It was made to move the age structure. So we had more older age bucks on the landscape to mimic a more natural situation. We know hunters will most often in Vermont will, at that point, would like to shoot the first available legal buck. So in 2015, we modified those deer regulations to try to improve antlerless deer hunting opportunity and create more of it. We went back and get it in 2019. So this whole idea of improving the buck age structure in Vermont's been going on for quite a long time. And I'm not going to say anymore because I'm going to allow, I know Nick has joined this, and he can answer that even more specifically than I can. And so Nick, please jump in. Correct me. I'm embarrassed to say, I don't even know what year exactly, 2006, when the antler point restriction went in, but you weren't hired then by us. I know I inherited this as wildlife director, but we went through several deer biologists at that point in time too, before we hired Nick. But go ahead and clean up any messes I made, Nick.
I'll do my best. I'm not sure what you did cover.
I just gave that. What Brad had a good question on are these rules changes that we made. We've done them in 2019, 2015, and the one previous to that was when the antler point restriction was kicked in. Was that done to change the age structure of the bucks? And I said, well, it really started before the two I mentioned. I mentioned the last two we did, 15 and 19. Told them we're going to have to be looking at it at the end of this year again. Our 5-year window's up, and trying to consider if we need to do any tweaks to the deer rule, what the interest of the board is.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I guess for a little background for those of you who are not aware of the whole process here, and I guess most of you probably weren't around through the last regulation change process. So the antler restriction was put in place in 2005, the initial one. We made some regulation tweaks in 2015, but didn't really touch the antler restriction. We changed bag limits, a couple other little things just before I started. And then in 2019, took effect in 2020, was when we removed the antler restriction from half the state, along with all the other recent changes. The 50% threshold thing here that has come up is actually not a regulation. It's an objective or a strategy to meet a goal, the hunter satisfaction goal in our 10-year big game plan. And that specific strategy is in order to get to the percentage of mature bucks that basically that we had prior to these rule changes, to maintain that percentage of mature bucks on the landscape, a simple measure to ensure that we will have that number of mature bucks or percentage of mature bucks is as long as we don't harvest more than 50, as long as less than 50% of our buck harvest is yearlings, that tells us our harvest rate is low enough, we're always going to have those mature bucks. So we set that as a simple, easy to measure threshold in our big game plan. So it's really just a means or a way to measure that we're actually achieving our objective from the big game plan. We did basically sell that, I guess I would say, as a safety net for our regulation changes. So when we remove the antler restriction in half the state, you know, the concern, of course, is potentially hunters are just going to go out there and shoot the first deer they see, and we're going to go back to most of our buck population being young bucks, which is not what our hunters want. So that 50% threshold was a safety net. You know, if we start exceeding 50% yearlings, that tells us we're harvesting, or our harvest rate's too high. Maybe we have to, you know, implement some other restrictions. Maybe re-implement the antler restriction, maybe something else. But if we're above 50%, we're not going to achieve our desired percentage of mature bucks. So that's where that comes from. As far as where we're at right now, and I know I touched on some of this, I think, at the last board meeting, but this past season, WMUs C and D1 exceeded 50%. C was right at 50% exactly. D1 was 53 or 54% yearlings. The prior year in 2021, we had 3 WMUs that exceeded D1, D2, and E2, actually. And again, they were all just over 50%. And so D1 has been 2 years in a row now of being just over 50%. I think it's important to keep in mind that in the big game plan, we never said, or I hope no one ever said, we certainly never intended for it to be a 1 year threshold. Like if we have 1 year of 50% yearlings, we need to react to it, because we know we can't react to 1 year of data ever. And honestly, even 2 years is not a trend. And given that we're barely over 50%, I would argue not something we need to concern ourselves with. We were maybe not ideally, but intentionally vague in the big game plan because we didn't know what we were going to see for numbers. So we wanted to leave ourselves some flexibility. So we didn't specify that, you know, it would be a 3-year average or exactly what the fifth, you know, when we would enforce or do something about that, crossing that 50% threshold. But it is there, and we should start having the conversation now about these WMUs that are exceeding it, right? We should start at least thinking about what we might do if this continues. I don't think we're at that point yet where we need to react to it. Specifically, and I'm pretty sure I talked about this last time as well, but the last 2 years, we've had, I guess I'll say, an abnormally or unusually high percentage of yearling bucks in the population, the general statewide buck population. So all WMUs statewide, we've just had a higher percentage of yearlings. It's a result of several years of things happening. We don't have a lot of 3 and 4-year-olds right now. Those are smaller age groups. So of course, just having fewer old deer increases your by percentage, right? That brings your percentage of young deer up. But we've also had really good yearling age classes, good fawn recruitment, it seems, at least, the last couple of years. So we've just happened to have had a lot of yearling deer. So of course, we're going to see some occasional spikes in the percentage of yearlings out there. And that's why I don't think we want to react to this. Certainly, I would call it overreact to this at this point. We should start thinking about it. Maybe if we want, we can have the discussions of what we do if it continues. But I don't think this is something we need to be concerned about yet. I guess I'll leave it there for now, unless someone has questions.
Thanks for reviewing that, Nick. I asked, and I didn't go into this, and it wasn't directly your question, Brad, but I do know there was some dialogue with you and the commissioner and a few other board members concerned on Dave Roberlard's comment at the public comment period at the last board meeting when we discussed the antlerless deer proposal to do this. So I felt it was important for Nick to clarify to the board what this means and the significance of harvesting over 50% of your bucks that are yearlings to do that. So that's why that probably wasn't the direct question, Nick, but I think I really appreciate you stating that because I asked you earlier for this meeting that you clarify that to the board. We are following the science of what it's telling us. And again, we're dealing with a situation of wild deer out there, different hunting conditions, scenarios, and that's why when we enact any new changes, such as this one back in 2019, we said to the board, give us a few years so we can work out those ups and downs that you experience with deer, hunter effort, which we saw in COVID, or food supplies out there, weather, all have immediate impacts on the harvest of that year. But Nick's available for any other questions that folks have. Again, too, this issue is not one that's on the table for the board tonight. Changing the APR, the antler point restriction, it will be on the board's agenda. And I told them, Nick, probably we need to have those discussions next winter in order to give the department and board time to go through administrative procedures, hearings, and so forth, if the board wants to do that. So,
Yeah.
David, are you having a hard time hearing me? I didn't know if that's.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't know
Yeah,
what's
it's
going
just-
on, Brad, with that, but
Could be on
maybe
his
someone
side.
on the board.
Yeah, no, you're coming in clear in the, from our perspective, we can hear you clearly, so it's between you and Dave, it sounds like.
Uh-oh, well, that's a history we have. He heard that. He heard that.
I think Dave Sawsville may have a question or a comment.
I'm just gonna make a comment. I always want to caution people when you're dealing with any population, whether it's deer, turkeys, waterfowl, you don't want to set yourself up with a knife edge decision. When you hit 50%, you have to go one direction or below 50% another, because you start making knee-jerk reactions, and it really confuses the public because they get flip-flop back and forth, APR, non-APR. And we've seen this where you really need to run 3, sometimes 4-year running averages, and that smooths out those years of many, young yearling deer in the population mixed in with a few older ones because you had a die off one year because of weather conditions or something else that affected them. So I would just, when you're mulling this over, really think about that, not making it so knife edge, because that will come back to haunt you. We've seen that in other population parameters where we said it's like you have to go that way.
David, while you're up.
Yep.
I show them what you showed me.
Yeah, but the show, Nick put together, and they do this every year for turkeys, deer, but the 2022 Vermont Whitetail Deer Harvest Report has a breakdown of fawns, adult bucks, things like that. And I think that was sent around to the board, but we can resend it. And that, I think that has the numbers you're looking for. And I can show you that during the break and see if that's what you're looking for. Okay. But that's online too, if you're looking at the website.
We just lost that.
Thanks, David, because I couldn't find that myself when I did a quick look. I forgot it was in the harvest report. So one of the questions Mike Colson asked was, why did we not include the Bruck aid structure breakdown in our recommendation? And
Yeah, the main reason it's not, well, it's not in the antlerless recommendation because it's not directly relevant, but it's not in the harvest report because we don't have those data when we draft the harvest report. We don't get all of the age results from rifle season until typically sometime in early April. So I usually get them just before the April board meeting where I would present to you guys, and I don't have time to usually go through them and analyze them before then. So.
Okay. Nick, I think that's it for questions.
Okay.
Unless there's anything else you want to share with us at this point?
Nope, I'm good.
Yeah.
Okay, then can I get a motion from somebody to accept the recommendation that's put forth by the department for youth novice season?
I will make a
Second?
Second.
Okay. Take a roll call vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye, and we'll start with Michael Bancroft. Aye. Brian Bailey. Aye. Nicholas Burnham.
Aye.
David Dean.
Okay, yes.
Jamie Dragon.
Yes.
Brian Perlin, yes. Allison Frazier.
Yes.
Michael Olson.
Yes.
Neil Hogan.
Yes.
Ryan McCarthy.
Yes.
Paul Noel.
Yes.
Robert Patterson.
Aye.
Dave Sweeney.
Yes.
And Buren. Okay, ayes have it. Thank you. Next item on the agenda is a wild turkey management update.
So my pleasure to introduce Chris Bernier, and as he's making his way up. This is one of those stories that I like to talk about when people ask about successes from the department. And, I don't want to steal his thunder, so I think you all know turkeys were reintroduced into the state. With that, let's burn you. Hello. Realizing on my way up here, driving the last times I came into the board were virtually because of the pandemic. And the same technology that made that possible is still used now, even though it's in person. So you get to watch me in person all through the technology. Did it remotely, but maybe just one sec.
While Chris is doing that, I just, he works out of the Springfield office. And he's been with us now 28, 29 years, Chris, somewhere there.
Somewhere in that ball.
A while, posted a number of different positions. And the Upland Game Bird project leader right now. He's done fur bear projects as a FAST leader. Does a lot of work with state lands management in his area. And he's very active and is very well respected by his peers for all the work that he does. Looks like he's ready.
Yeah. So is there anyone else in the room that's experiencing a little bit of sleep deprivation? I'm glad I'm not alone. So bear my way through this. I have really two fundamental goals in realizing that this conversation started several years ago, 2020, and that there's several new faces to the board that have been part of the conversation as it's progressed. So I want to do a recap of the conversation related to fall management of turkeys. The management of the hunting seasons for turkeys. The other objective is basically just giving an update on what I've accomplished or we've accomplished since I presented last, which was 2021. So we've had 2 years
lapsed since I was on this topic in front of the board, and just give you a quick update on what's happened since then. Oh, yeah, there's actually 3 objectives. I'm sorry. Trying to be coy here, but I also realized as I was pulling this presentation together, first, can everyone hear me okay? Speaking loud enough, and everyone can hear me online? Good. As I was pulling this together, that I don't know of any time where the board had been presented information about other upland game birds other than turkeys. So I just wanted to take a moment briefly before I get into turkeys to just give you a quick update on some upland game birds. So one of the first things that I did in taking this position, the wild turkey project leader position in 2016 or 17, was expanding that project to include the all the upland game birds. And that's essentially means including them in the federal aid grant that we use for, our funding and our direction for these species. So the 3 species here, I should say the federal aid grant that I'm talking about is the Sport, Fish and Wildlife Restoration Grant. It's a program with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It's funded by Pittman Robertson funds, which I'm sure you've all heard about. That is a significant funding source for the work that I do in the field on these species. Prior to 2017, again, these other species I'm talking about now weren't included. So it really hobbled our ability to do any sort of management or respond to any needs on those species because we didn't have funding. Or the focus that we need in a project specific way to actually move conservation forward with them. So the 3 species pictured here, ringneck pheasant, bobwhite quail, and chukar partridge, are actually non-native to the state, and they're essentially non-existent in the state here, except through private stocking. So, really, it's not a big lift to manage them, but it was important to include them in the grant and the project because there is still some public interest in them, and the department administers a number of permits specifically for these species, as well as some other species. And you can see that there are single-digit numbers of permits issued each year, which is, indicates at least a small interest here in the state in these birds. These are pretty consistent numbers, even dating back a decade or so from here. So it hasn't changed much. And it's largely the same individuals, organizations, clubs, or whatever that are requesting these permits. But having them included in our upland game bird project allows us to track these permits more closely, to make sure that doesn't change. Trend, increase interest or just a lapse of interest altogether, but also to do the disease surveillance necessary to ensure that they're not introducing any sort of diseases here in the state. So this bird here, I'm sure you all recognize, the ruffed grouse. It's the iconic sentinel of Vermont woods, right? It's beloved by hunters and non-hunters alike. Everyone knows that startling flush in the woods, but that kind of ethereal drumming that just fills your head and you don't even know which direction it's coming from. Those of you who've been sitting out in the turkey woods, I'm sure this has been your backdrop, which is really one of the reasons why I like turkey hunting. The ruffed grouse is the 4th most pursued species here in the state. Deer, turkeys, bear, and grouse. So they are certainly beloved game species. In fact, this is the species that got me into hunting as a youth in Maine, and it's probably the species that's responsible for my time here now. And in Vermont, which is in the core of ruffed grouse range, the species is widespread and abundant wherever suitable habitat exists. However, suitable habitat is becoming increasingly difficult, or not increasingly difficult to find, but it's becoming, a little bit less prevalent on the landscape. I don't know how well you can see the slide. Is there a way of expanding one screen?
Yep.
So prior to including grouse in the Upland Game Bird project, we really didn't have, again, the funding mechanism or the focus to basically collect much data on the species, which was not really necessary. They're secure, they still are secure in the state now. So we spend our time and energy on other species, but we can turn to other data sources. In the case of this graph here, this is the Audubon Society's Christmas bird count data, which has been going on for decades now. And we can see that there are some trends. Each line here is a different state. Vermont is the top line. And you can see they all have the commonality of declining trends across their range. In fact, in some parts of their range, not here in New England and Northeast, but further south especially, they're seeing declines as much as 70%. Here across the Northeast, it's around 50% declines over a 30-year period. So what's causing these declines? Well, we know that habitat is a big driver, right? Our forests are maturing. Our forest industry is changing. So with that maturing of the forest, we're losing those young forest habitats. It's 20-year-old or less forest habitats that this animal relies on. So it's a young forest obligate species, as are many, many other species, which are also in decline because of the continued maturation of the forest and loss that's happening. But there's also other issues, some of which we don't know the full extent of, change in climate, land use changes, development. West Nile virus is a big contributor to declines, as we've learned of late. So what are we doing about this? And don't fret over these numbers. You don't need to see those. This is just a talking point picture here. But one of the first things I did when it was brought to my attention that we needed to pick this up was to look for data sources. And I worked with Nick Fortin back in 2016 to get rough grouse added to our deer hunter sighting surveys. You've all been presented deer hunter sighting survey data by Nick, both for deer and for moose, I believe. So you're familiar with this data source, but we expanded it to grouse, and we were able to do that before having grouse even part of the project because it's really a free thing. You're just adding a column on a survey that's already going out the door. Interestingly, well, we have now 7 years of data, which is still a little bit, right to David's point earlier, that even 7 years of data sometimes is not sufficient to really detect trends. That aside, you can look at this same data, this is the exact same data set displayed spatially, and you can actually still glean good information from it, even though it may not be trend oriented. So I look at this, and let me explain it first. The red are areas where deer hunters are sighting the most grouse per 10 hours of hunting. In the dark blue are the areas where they're seeing the least amount of grouse per 10 hours of hunting. So when I look at this, this actually is almost exactly what I would expect Vermont to look like for grouse. We know the Northeast Kingdom is a hot spot, as well as the rest of the Northeast Highlands and the Piedmont, the Northeast Kingdom. We know the spine in the Green Mountains and the Central Valley there is decent. It's not best. The white is kind of average, right? It's not good or bad, it's right in the middle. And the reason why I point this out is because this will come up with turkeys in just a minute. When you see data like this that is actually what you expect and it's explainable, that you can understand it, it builds confidence in that data set. It builds confidence in that trend, not the trend, but the index. Does that make sense? So this, I pulled this up and it made no sense to the reality as I understood it, then I would have very little confidence that really that was a useful data set. But I'm very excited about it. But it's always good to have multiple data sets going. These species, all of them require multiple inputs of data to really fully get the rounded picture of what's going on. So boy, from my angle, that looks terrible. That's why it's better. Oh, yeah, it does get. Not worried about it. But beginning last year, we got a grant from the Forest Ecosystem Monitoring Cooperative to conduct a research project with the specific objectives of or testing ARUs, which are autonomous reporting units. You're all familiar with game cameras. The ARU is the game camera of audio recording. So you put it up in the landscape and it captures audio clips. And so this grant through FEMC was to test this device for its utility in helping us monitor grouse across the landscape, and to develop a protocol, assuming it was useful for that, to developing a protocol that we could then apply to different regions of the state as necessary where we had concern to collect data on the species that will help us develop these conservation strategies that we need. The one thing I really like about this project is that it's partner-based. So we work with the Green Mountain National Forest and the Rough Grouse Society and UVM hand in hand on this project. And those partnerships really build collaboration. They build knowledge of the issues and a desire to actually address them. So working with the Forest Service, they're excited because we're putting these out in their areas where they're planning to do some of these early successional cuts, so that we can actually demonstrate over time how that's going to impact grouse in those areas, or hopefully positive, which I'm sure it will. So these partnership projects, I really tend to love. Changing gears a little bit from monitoring, talk just about West Nile virus, which I mentioned a minute ago. West Nile virus is an arthropod-borne virus that's transmitted by mosquitoes. It was first discovered here in North America, in New York, actually in 1999. And by today, it's been documented in over 300 avian species across the whole continent. So it's spread widely. It has varying impact on the species. Some species are highly susceptible to it, as are grouse. We know that. There's a high level of morbidity and mortality associated with West Nile infections for grouse. Some species can get it and not be all that bothered by it. Knowing that we had West Nile virus here, and knowing that we had other issues for grouse, we needed to step up and figure out what we needed to do here with grouse and how big of an issue is it. So we partnered with the University of Georgia, the Southeast Cooperative Wildlife Disease Study, to collect samples, actually turning to our hunter partners, who in short order produced a lot of samples, which was much appreciated, to use hunter harvested grouse to collect blood and feathers to send to this lab in Georgia for testing for antibodies for West Nile virus. And though the field portion, the sampling and the analysis of the samples is just wrapped up, there is still much analysis to take place. And we're waiting for the final report on that. But the preliminary results do illuminate some important things. That number one, Vermont's not, an outlier, like the numbers of seroprevalence, we call it, that's the percentage of samples that actually detect antibodies, is in line with other states. We also learned from this that actually grouse do survive, right? So if they turn up in a hunter harvest, they're beyond the season where they would have already died by infection. So they have been infected in like August or mosquito season. Now they turn up and it kills them quick. Then they turn up in a hunter's bag and they get sampled. They've already passed that window of mortality. So, and they have antibodies, that's what we're detecting. So that's good news, right? So some survive, actually a fair amount. We also learned that across the landscape, the infection rates vary dramatically. And we're not really sure for certain. That's part of the ongoing study into this, but at this point, we're not really sure what drives that other than habitat. That's the one thing that people have settled on so far as the most significant driver of infection rates. And on that note, on the habitat front, we all recognize that when you talk about grouse, as well as many other species, turkeys included, it's about habitat, right? Grouse in particular. So it's an all hands on deck approach with habitat. We leave no stone unturned in our endeavor to get out there and to beat the drum, excuse the pun, about creating habitat for grouse. Because when we do that, we're also creating habitat for a whole host of other species. They're like an umbrella species. So we partner with different organizations, NGOs, anyone who partner with us, private landowners, our own state lands are consistently and constantly being managed for the betterment of these sorts of habitats. The last thing I'm going to say about grouse before jumping into turkeys is that, and this is probably one of the most proud things that I've been a part of, or proud to be a part of it, is the Eastern Grouse Working Group. It's a consortium of individuals and organizations that have been corralled around the table, so to speak, to basically compile, develop, and push forward a recovery plan for the species. And the importance of a recovery plan is that it provides a mechanism for leveraging funds, for directing research objectives, so that it's not every state going it alone, so that we have one unifying document that helps us move forward collectively and place habitat on the ground and address the issues that need to be addressed. So this is ongoing. It's been a little bit of a spell since we've met, because the principal leader of it retired from the position or moved on to a different position. So we're kind of regrouping, but this will be something I'll be working on in the near future. All right, thank you for my little digression out of those birds. I just had to do it. Yeah.
Quick, what's the life expectancy of a grouse?
I think they're fairly short-lived, as are most our selected species, which grouse are. So probably 3 to 5 years. You're going to have outliers that can go much longer. Like turkeys, for example, they're around 4 to 5 years would be kind of your typical long-term, but they've been documented into the teens. So I think grouse is the same.
Quick question.
Yeah.
On grouse, West Nile virus is all been aware of for a long time.
Yeah.
Have you seen avian influenza being a factor at all for grouse?
No, I've not heard of, or I haven't heard anywhere across the range that being an issue for grouse. And, it's in part because of their behavior, maybe. I don't know about their susceptibility to that, but just their behavior. They're not ones that really congregate. And I think transmission within the flock is not going to be as prevalent. I know that seems
Honestly, that, and they're not scavengers. A lot of the birds that were being affected with AI are things like vultures and eagles that are scavenging the sick waterfowl. So they're, like I said, they're not a flocking bird that's shedding it and passing it on to others.
So here we are, the star of the show. I just want to start by saying how rewarding it is to work on such a cool bird, right? This is a super cool bird. And it's also humbling because I am working off the backs of multiple predecessors who have positioned me to control. The incredible resource that we have today is not necessarily borne out by my own work, but by my predecessors who've worked really hard to get us to where we are today. So that's a very humbling thing for me and super exciting to be a part of. And it bears mentioning just briefly the history. I think the commissioner kind of touched on it a little bit, but I always feel like it's good to set that stage right back to the beginning here, so that when we talk about where we go, we have some real look back on where we've been. And we are now celebrating 50 years of hunting in Vermont. So 2023 is our 50th hunting season in Vermont. Mind you, this picture on the left was taken at the first release of turkeys here in the state in 1969. And the person on the right in that picture still works for the department. So I point this out to make the point that yes, we have an incredible resource here. It's not always been that way. We have gotten here through a lot of hard work, but this has been fairly quick. 50 years is not that long of time. It's been remarkable. And, you look at where we are today. This is a harvest graph, just raw harvest per year. And you can see, less than 1993 or earlier than 1993, it just bobbles back and forth, mostly below 1,000. But you can see where we are. We've leveled off since the early 2000s. Our harvest goes up and down almost in a regular pattern, somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000. Turkeys have far exceeded our expectations. They occupy the entire state, well beyond their historic range here in the state. In fact, hunters harvest turkeys in almost every town of the state, which is in itself a remarkable feat. Last year, hunters harvested turkeys in 242 towns out of the 251 towns, which is pretty cool. And through this sustainable management and sustainable harvest, hunters are putting 160,000 servings of turkeys on their tables for their families here in Vermont, which is awesome. I just think that's the coolest thing. Hunters have incredible success, right? So our typical spring season, I know, I'm not one of them for the record, but you know,
I'm preserving a lot of turkeys for you.
spring hunter success rate is anywhere around 20 to 25%, which is pretty remarkable. Youths are over 30% annually. Those spring hunters, regular in-season spring hunters who harvest one bird, 37% of them harvest a second bird, which is awesome. We have high hunter satisfaction. We have in our 2018 public opinion survey, hunters said they were either somewhat satisfied or very satisfied by their turkey hunting experiences in the past 5 years. I think it was 94% were in those categories, which is remarkable, no matter how you look at it. And let's not forget the intrinsic value of turkeys, right? So this is a sustainable thing. We are utilizing the species for our consumption, but there is no shortage of them on the landscape to fulfill their role for their whole host of other, things that they do, right? So their ecological roles as a primary prey, a keystone prey, I would say in some respects, I'm sure has affected has influenced the population of other species, and just the way that people, the intrinsic value of the turkeys, right? We all like to look at turkeys out in the field, especially this time of year with their antics. So they've got it covered. So we got here in 50 years, and the one point that I want you to take from this slide is that we got here by a very thoughtful, deliberate, and conservative approach to managing turkeys. And as the Upland Game Bird Project leader, it's my intent to continue that approach from here forward. So looking at 2022, because 2023 is still in progress. So just a really quick update on the season. As we pass these around. I wish these were in color. Unfortunately, they did not come out in color. This is the 2022 harvest report.
Thank you.
You can save it for later if you want. I'm just going to highlight a couple quick things. So licenses sold this past year, again, this is calendar year 2022, 18,710. That's down from the spike we saw in 2020, the pandemic spike, but this has been holding steady at pre-pandemic levels, and I haven't seen really any change in license sales. The youth weekend harvest was 627. The 10-year average, the previous 10-year average, 634, which is right on target. Total spring harvest was, 5,589. The previous 10-year spring harvest was 4,955. So a significant bump up in the spring harvest last year. And the fall harvest was right at, essentially right at the previous 10-year average. So last year, by all measures, was an average or above average year in terms of harvest. This year, looking at very preliminary numbers, because again, the season's ongoing and I don't have ready access to some of those data, but it's looking like we're going to meet or exceed all of these. In fact, the youth season, which has wrapped up, and I have probably my best data source for now, because it's been wrapped up for several weeks, we harvested 730 plus turkeys in the youth season. So we are above the 10-year average. Maybe not going to make the all-time record of 780 something turkeys. All right, so now we'll move into the nuts and bolts of what we really wanted to talk about. So I want to start with a look back at how we got to where we are here and the management that we all do. So all the big game species, which you all know, are managed in accordance with these publicly vetted big game plans in 10-year intervals. So these plans are compiled using the most contemporary science. They're compiled with public input, both prior public surveys as well as in the process public comment periods. focus groups, interest groups. We've done a lot of outreach on the development of these. And they're also deliberated on almost ad nauseum amongst the big game team in every little aspect of the strategies and what's good and what's bad. And so in this, 2020, the current plan that we're in, for turkeys, we identified 5 principal objectives, which would be turkey population monitoring. And then within each objective, there are multiple strategies. And so, for example, turkey population monitoring, we had several strategies, including continuing our evaluation of harvest data as it comes in and looking at that upside down and sideways, to revamp some of the existing data collection systems that we use, like the brood survey that some of you probably participated in. We'll have revamped that. And then also looking for new means of indexing this population, which I'm going to talk more about in a minute. But we also had an objective for managing the turkey population and the harvest of them, so the season structure. And within that, we had a bunch of different strategies, including liberalizing the fall, which is the point of the topic, liberalizing shot size, establishing novice season, so on and so forth. Our other objectives included disease monitoring, the few strategies related to damage complaints monitoring and trying to get a handle on that, and of course habitat objectives. So what's important to point out here is what's not in the plan, right? So I'm sure as board members, you hear from publics who ask one of 2 questions related to turkeys. Why don't we move the season earlier? Or why don't we have an all-day hunt? Right? And so rest assured that both of those, we hear that as well. I hear that almost daily from friends, from colleagues, from everyone. We grappled with those at the big game team planning process for this plan. And it's worth noting that on those 2 subjects, at face value, they make sense, right? Winters are ending sooner. Turkeys are in the field sooner. Why wouldn't we move the season sooner to take advantage of that? Problem is, it does not work like that. So the breeding chronology of turkeys does not change with weather, right? The breeding chronology is set by a circadian rhythm, right? So it's daylight. It's those factors which set that. And so the spring season is set in accordance with that reproductive chronology. So turkeys start laying their eggs, hens start laying their eggs toward mid-April. They lay 10 to 12 eggs over the course of a couple weeks. When they have laid their full clutch of eggs, they start incubating that. So that's when they move to the nest and they sit on those eggs around the clock or nearly so. That's when you want to begin your hunting season, right? So when all the eggs have been laid and the nests are being sat on and incubated. And in Vermont, we had a research project for one of my predecessors, a graduate research project, which identified here in the state that that happened in the first week of May. It's actually around the end of the first week of May. So really our spring season starts a little on the early side already, if you wanted to get technical about it. Then the other thing too is that prior to them laying on or incubating those eggs, if they are disturbed by a hunter or anyone for that matter, they are actually more likely to abandon that clutch. Once they have laid the whole clutch and they've sat and incubated, they're less likely to abandon it. They may flush off, but they're going to come back. And so that leads into the second question: why don't we have all-day hunting? Which again, at face value, makes sense. We don't limit it really for any other species, I believe. So why turkeys? Well, again, thoughtful, deliberate, and conservative approach has led us to the success that we have today, and this is one of them. And giving turkeys a break in the woods for them to not be disturbed, not pushed off a nest, we felt was key. And there are other factors associated with it, right? The landowners across the state are more in tune with turkey hunters being out just during the morning. Changing that also maybe affects landowner perception on that. It changes the duration of the hunting day. maybe that would have a negative consequence, maybe not. But also you get into issues of people hunting on roosts. So you're getting toward the evening, you know, where birds are going up to roost. Is that something we wanted to go down the path of? And we at the big game team decided no. There are states that have liberalized all-day hunting, and they've done it different ways. Some states have just opened it up, and apparently without too much problems in that regard. But there are other states like Pennsylvania, I think it is, that open up half of their season. The later half is all-day hunting when less hunters are in the woods because most of either tagged out or they're just done hunting. But also the birds are that much further along in their incubation and that much less likely to flush off. So I don't want to leave the conversation saying those are off the table. I think they're off the table for this planning period. We will reevaluate them in the next 10-year plan and we'll reconsider them at that point. But for this time, we are really focusing on
I've lost sound again.
I stopped talking, sorry. Well, I got ahead of myself, but so with respect to the big game plan and all those strategies that we put in there, we have made significant accomplishments since 2020. Now, this is not a full list of all of our accomplishments with respect to turkeys. I mean, we have done a lot of partner work with the NWTF, we've done a lot of outreach, a lot of R3 initiatives, a lot of habitat work. This is a list of accomplishments specific to the big game plan. So these things you see here listed are actually things taken right out of big game plan. So in 2020, we implemented online reporting, huge success, I think. Over 60% of our hunters now report their turkeys online. In 2021, we liberalized shot size to take advantage of new technology in shots, specifically non-lead alternatives that were super effective for turkeys and probably a better choice, and also opened up other gauge sizes, which would be more attractive to other people who aren't interested in being punished by the old trusty 12 gauge. We established a novice season, which is at this point, you know, not a ton of people have taken advantage of, but there have been a number of people that have done so, and those that have been very happy for that opportunity. And I think it's a great season. We reconfigured the brood survey. I think I just spoke about that to make it align with the regional standard. And so with the standardization of our brood survey, so we can now compare it across the region. And for those of you that were here in 2021, I gave a presentation on just that topic about how we revamped the brood survey so that we can look broader about what it means. And it's pretty awesome. The take home is that Vermont is in really good shape with respect to our brood rearing conditions, both in terms of climate and habitat. That's brood rearing conditions in the Northeast, and our annual brood production indices track that. One of the things that I have spent a significant amount of time on, and it's kind of, you know, it's a legacy item for me that exposes me as a geek, I'm sure, but is the restructuring of our turkey harvest database. I have had a lot of predecessors in this role, and with every change of the guards, you have a change of how the data is being collected and how it's being organized and how it's being summarized. And so to step into this role back in 2016 or 17, I had nowhere to turn for a one-stop shop for data that I could run a report that would capture the whole data set back to 1973. And as a turkey manager, that's critical. That retrospective look is absolutely critical. And so I spent, honestly, hours of compiling data, formatting it to make sure it's all the same, working with our IT department to get table structure lined out, and blah, 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 you get it. But it has been a boon for me already, and I think it's going to be extremely helpful in our conversations ahead. We also developed and tested several survey methods, particularly hunter effort survey methods, which you've heard me talk about again in 2021. I talked a little bit about some of our piloting work with that, with the NWTF, who I worked with to pilot a hunter effort survey. Just a little primer. harvest alone is meaningful and helpful, but unless you have some way of normalizing it, I like to say, it's really hard to interpret by itself. So you harvest 10 animals, is that, if you don't have any idea of how much effort went into those 10 animals, it's not meaningful in terms of a population, right? So if it took 100 people to harvest those 10 birds, well, then you've got a population issue probably. If it took one person to harvest those 10 birds, you probably don't have a population issue. So getting some measure of normalized harvest data, so a catch per unit of effort. We do it with really all of our species. And so we, in the past several years, starting in 2022, with our own data sets, and before that with the pilot study with WTF, we've been collecting on our effort data. I'm going to show you that in just a second. And last in this list here is the fact that we just began, actually, a couple weeks ago, a conversation about getting at the animal damage nuisance behavior part of our big game plan strategy, which is to basically figure out a way of capturing that data set so that we can use it to inform management, right? So how turkeys are perceived in the landscape is important, and we want to make sure that we maintain them in an appropriate social carrying capacity so that people appreciate this bird, so they don't become pests. Because when they become pests, our ability to manage them diminishes. So we want to get a better handle on how turkeys are interacting with people across the landscape. Right now, a lot of people take care of it themselves. Sometimes they call wardens, sometimes they call a district office. I have no one-stop shop for that data to come into me in a compiled way. So that's what we're working on. And I anticipate that unrolling just within the year here. All right, enough of that. So why the focus on fall strategy, fall season strategy? Well, there's a lot of good reasons for it. Again, these strategies here are right out of the big game plan. So we've made all these other accomplishments that I just went through. These are the things that we really need to continue working on, get at, which really is the last remaining piece of our big game puzzle for 2020 to 2030. So why the importance on fall management? Well, although 63% of the hunters that we hold in the development of our big game plan, 63% of them strongly favored prioritizing the quality of spring hunting over fall hunting, right? So despite that, 49% of hunters still hunt turkeys in the fall. 10% exclusively so. So you don't want to forget that. It's still a game species in the fall. The other thing that's important to note is that the fall season is where you have your best opportunity for actually managing a population, right? I think today, we talked about antlerless tags, doe permits, so on and so forth. It's the same thing. In the fall, we harvest hens. It's the only time of year that we allow hens to be taken. So it is the opportunity we have to manage populations. So we want to get our ducks in a row so that we can actually apply or to develop a system of managing the fall hunt that gives us the ability to be adaptive and regional. So where we may eventually need to reduce a population because there are too many turkeys, there are too many nuisance issues, we have the tools in hand to be able to do that. But we want also to maximize the opportunity for everyone through this, right? So we have to have maximize the opportunity. I'm talking about hunters, non-hunters alike. So we have to have a way of regulating the fall season that is based on the reality of that region. I didn't do a very good job explaining it. Does that make some sense? Mm-hmm. You're very gracious with that. Oh yeah, I wanted to say one other thing regarding this on the slide here is why fall, the focus on fall. During our big game plan public opinion survey, 66% of the respondents said that they were in favor, I think even strongly in favor, of longer fall seasons. 62% of the respondents said they were in favor of increased bag limits in the fall. So you compare that to 54% who wanted a longer or all-day spring hunt. So that's certainly not a mandate. Still, the majority of people who responded wanted an all-day hunt. But certainly more respondents were interested in adjusting the fall season. And there were a lot less that were strongly opposed to those strategies as well. So we felt like we have the opportunity here in the fall to really capture what we want to do with the species. So looking back a bit, some of you who've been on the board for the longest will recognize this slide. Our prior system of managing the fall hunts was based on a threshold of 0.75 toms harvested in the spring per area of habitat, forested habitat. That was the threshold that was used, similar to the discussion we had moments ago. It had to be above that threshold in a WMU for at least 3 years for us to consider opening up fall opportunities in that WMU. Now that actually worked really well as our turkey population was still expanding in the state and still prospering. I think at this point, it really lost its utility. We have turkeys everywhere, and there are many things that affect what we call the harvest density. That's what that is, the 0.75 toms per acre of habitat, the harvest density. And you can see by this that we're not really even in accordance with that threshold anymore. We've kind of moved beyond it. So the green are areas of the state that are above that threshold, where we would have opened a fall season, and the areas in red are below that threshold, where according to our own threshold shouldn't be open. But you know, the only place in the state where we don't have a fall season are WMUs E1, E2, C, and A. A has been above the threshold for quite some time now. C has been right at the threshold. E has not been there, I don't think, ever. So at any rate, it's my goal, the big game team goal, department's goal is to use the data that we have, find additional data sets, and develop a way of analyzing that informs our ability to liberalize or contract fall opportunities, as we've talked about. So why it seems easy, and really on paper it should be, but turkeys offer some particularly challenging issues for us. So this is an R-selected species, meaning that they operate at full reproductive capacity, right? So a bear is a K-selected species, so they're operating at carrying capacity. They have fewer young, longer rearing periods. They don't necessarily breed every year. They're older animals. They have higher survival rates. R-selected species are more akin to like mosquitoes. I don't want to say these guys are like mosquitoes, but they are more like
Mosquitoes right now are as big as turkeys.
But they reproduce every year. They have large clutches. They are short-lived, relatively speaking, and they have high susceptibility to any host of factors of mortality, high rates of mortality. The thing about turkeys is that they are incredibly reactive to population change, right? So if any condition changes, they can die off quick, or they can boom. And we see that in all the data. It's all, when you look at any WMU, or even statewide for that matter, the indexes are all like this. Their populations are all over the board. That's what they do. That's what our selected species do. It makes it very difficult to estimate a population, and it makes it even more difficult to model a population. And so you have to have indexes of population change over time in order to make management decisions on. And so that's our principal challenge here. So I'm going to look at, I think, half a dozen slides here of different indexes that we've been toying with, right? This is one that I actually presented on this as well in 2021, I think it was. This, I had really high hopes for this. So we have this incredible licensing database that the numbers of hunters who've purchased licenses dating back for a long time, all the different licenses that they've held. And I think there has to be some way of capitalizing on that for our objectives here. And so I worked with our GIS expert, Ryan Knox, and we geocoded all of the addresses of these licensed hunters in our database and to put them on a map, right? I had high hopes that we would be able to start developing an index of turkey harvest per hunter density. So that would be, again, a normalized index of harvest. And I think it would be very helpful. I have not given up on it, but suffice it to say, it proved very complicated because of the layers and the scales of the different data sets. You couldn't extract harvest at the same scale as hunter distribution and then to create that comparison. I have since had conversations with Ryan, and I think it is possible, and I'm going to continue to work on it. But one thing that did come out of this, and it's pretty obvious, is that this is hunter distribution, mind you. It's not even. We know that that's intuitive. But that's important in itself, is when you compare it to harvest here on the right. So the map on the left is the exact same one you're just looking at. The one on the right is the distribution of the turkey harvest in 2022. I don't know how well that sticks out to you with the graphics here, but they're virtually identical. There are very few differences. I think one of the most glaring differences is there's Burlington right here, has no harvest in it, no surprises there, but yet it has a lot of turkey hunters in it. And there are a couple other examples of like that across the state, like the Rutland area, you can see is a high density of hunters and not so much in the way of turkey harvest. But the point is, not looking at it like that, but the point is that hunter distribution has to be considered when you're talking about regulating a harvest, because regulate is not going to have the same impact across the landscape because we have different numbers of hunters across the landscape, different pressure. And so these data sets will absolutely be part of our metric going forward, is tracking hunter distribution. Ideally, at some point, we can pull it off harvest per hunter density. So you recognize this map from the grouse portion. Same data set, the deer hunter sighting survey data. And I was really excited with the grouse part because it made complete sense when I saw it. Like, well, that's explainable. And I look at this and I'm thinking, well, that's actually pretty good as well. I mean, it makes some sense. Again, the red are areas where hunters saw more turkeys per 10 hours of hunting. And the dark blue are where they saw the least amount of turkeys per 10 hours of hunting. And the white areas are kind of in between, as are the pink and the light blue. So you got a sense of, in my mind, distribution of turkeys across the state here. And it makes some sense, right? We know that there are probably less turkeys based on the habitat and probably climate as well in the deep Northeast Kingdom, Grand Isle, the spine of the Green Mountains as well. And, you know, J1, J2, the central Connecticut River Valley, White River Valley, that's always a hotspot for turkeys. That's one perennially. Most birds harvested that. And B, interestingly, B is not as well represented in this, which I'm scratching my head about that. Regardless, the point here is that we have this data set that we can track now over time for trends to see if things start to change in any of these WMUs. And with that is knowledge, and with the knowledge is the implementation of adaptive management strategy. Yeah, so I'm always looking at different ways of using the existing data that we have. Because half the battle of data is collecting it. So if you've already got it, let's use it to its full advantage. And in that respect, I took a deep dive and have for not just for this, but for a long time now, in our existing harvest data set. And trying to figure out ways, again, of having some normalized harvest data. I came up with this proportion of successful hunters, proportion of hunters who harvest one bird that actually have harvested two birds. So it's that second bird success rate. And we start looking at it. And again, on the left, it's the same deer hunter sighting survey map you just looked at. And now the new one, the proportion of successful hunters harvesting the second bird here on the right. And you look at it, there's still some commonality between the maps, which is great. It's still demonstrating that there's some meaning there. But then there's some anomalies like E2. It's like, wow, well, a lot of hunters in E2 seem to be harvesting their second bird. And, you know, I need to dig deeper into that to look at the data to see about sample sizes. See if there's some data in there that's, you know, erroneous. That does happen, it's all in there, but it is interesting nonetheless that it's kind of a similar pattern and helps me to develop confidence again that there's some utility to this metric for indexing the population. Yeah.
So let's suppose I shot my first turkey in E1 and my second one in Grand Isle. Where would that show up on that map?
It would show up in Grand Isle.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a second bird to you.
Got it.
First bird for you in Grand Isle, but a second bird to you. Yeah. There's bias in interpretation in all of this, right? That is the challenge that we have is understanding these data sets to tease out those biases and challenges, or at least to be able to explain them. And that what you just got right to the core of the struggle I had with the hunter distribution data. Yes, the distribution and the harvest look pretty similar, but they're not one for one. Hunters go all over the place. So it's a little bit of a challenge there to figure out. So this was the focus of a lot of effort over the past several years as well. I'm sure some of you have actually contributed to some of this data here. So there are two data collection processes represented on this graph. The gray line on the top is actually hunter effort data. That is birds killed per day of hunting. That is collected through the Vermont Outdoors app. And last year was our first year. I had hoped to get that up and running in 2021, but for reasons beyond my control, I couldn't. So we lost a year of data there. But this is 2022 data alone. The two bottom graphs are 2021 and 2022 hunter effort data collected by our online reporting. So who's reported turkeys online? Yeah, so you know, as you get toward the end, you now have to answer how many days, how many hours, how many times. This is the data. And the app collects the data a little differently than the online reporting system. So I had to subset these data sets so that they were comparable. So it's not the full data sets. I subset them for the first bird killed per day for this comparison. But it really demonstrated the utility of both these instruments for collecting the data. Number one is you can see that the app data is consistently higher. And I'm not really fully sure why, because in my mind, it should be lower because the app data, Vermont Outdoors app data, is not related to your success, right? So when you were what's called the POS, that's point of sale, sorry for the acronym there. The POS is our online reporting system. That is only successful hunters, right? No one else goes in to add that data in unless they're reporting a turkey. So it's only polling successful hunters. Whereas Vermont Outdoors app is open to any hunter. That's the point I'm trying to make. So I was thinking, well, you would have more data of zero success in the Vermont Outdoors app, which would lower the kill per day index. But in fact, I saw just the opposite there. It's weird. The one thing that is striking here is the variability of the app data. It's all over the board. And it's worth noting that sample sizes here have been a challenge. They were a challenge in 2022, and they've been a challenge so far this year to get hunters to actually use the app. We think at this point we're at closing in on 1,500 to 1,600 individual records of effort for both seasons, 2021, 2022, and 2023. That's not a lot when we start breaking it out per WMU and per season. In fact, if you look at WMU's E1 and E2, you've got a perfect one, right? And that's because one hunter for that year, or that data is 2022, one hunter went out one day and shot one bird. So you have a success rate of 1. So that's really not reflective of reality of the greater Northeast Kingdom.
That would be me.
Was it?
Yeah.
And you put your data into the Vermont Outdoors app. There you go. So again, interpretation, understanding the data, understanding its limitations, its biases is absolutely critical. On the POS front, the two colored lines down below, what is really striking and exciting to me is that they are much less variable. So they're not prone to these wide swings, a lot higher sample sizes. So that makes them better. That's probably why the variability is not so bad. But also it's 2 different years of data and they really track each other well. I mean, there are some differences. You can see I is a little bit askew. You can see, I think that might be M from this angle. It's hard to tell. That's a little askew, but otherwise they're very similar. And again, just like I talked about with the grouse deer hunter sighting survey, when you see something that is explainable and like makes sense, you start to build confidence that that index is going to tell you something. And I think our online reporting system, I think will really be a critical tool for collecting hunter effort data that will be very informative of our decisions moving forward. Super excited about that. And it's worth noting that we're not giving up on the Vermont Outdoors app because it gives us that data from non-successful hunters. And so we tweaked the app this year to get it a little bit dialed in better. And we're going to try to champion it even more in the coming years because those unsuccessful hunters we want to hear from as well. So looking at the POS, again, the online reporting data itself, in the same format that we've been looking at these other data sets, you start to look at it and you know, it's interesting. This is hard to fully explain what's going on, but it appears that the Northeast Kingdom is a hotspot for turkey harvest, right? And maybe in fact it is. But you can't interpret this alone by itself. There's a whole bunch of other factors here. But when you look at the online reporting that we've now collected for 2 full years, and I think, yeah, and I even included what we had of 2023 to date, the Northeast Kingdom, not including D2, really pop out as having some of the higher, success rates, the highest number of birds harvested per day. There are things that can explain that, and that may be that, well, number one, you remember the distribution, hunter harvest? There was a notable lapse or gap in the Northeast Kingdom. So you have fewer hunters. And those hunters know where to go. They know that down in the Connecticut River Valley, there are birds. They're not hunting in the Nalhegan Basin. So that's not where I would go necessarily to hunt turkeys. But so yeah, this may be very accurate. They have high success rates, but it's in specific spots, which is making this data come out this way, and probably less data. So it's a sample size issue. But still, otherwise, it makes a lot of sense to me in the way that it plays out. And then you add, this is the online reporting data. This is, again, including unsuccessful hunters. So it changes it a fair amount. And B really pops out, and F1 really pop out as being hotspots when you include the data of unsuccessful hunters. I don't want to get too much into the weeds on interpreting this because, quite frankly, I haven't had time to really take a deep dive on it all. We're just at this point starting to be in a position to start compiling the data with it just now being a couple years into it. But suffice it to say, there's a lot to be learned from an analysis of this data, which is my prerogative going forward. And so here, the last slide, promise, unless you want me to get up here and sing and dance more, I can. But the last slide here, I pulled directly from my presentation in 2020 when we kicked this all off. So I didn't change a thing. This is right out of 2020, and I did that purposefully so to make the point that we are actually pretty much on target time-wise with what we set out in 2020. Here we are in 2023, and we're not proposing any regulation changes. So that's true. We're a little behind in that regard. We had some obstacles through 2021, 2022 in collecting these data sets and getting enough data to actually make sense of it. But we aren't far off. I feel confident in saying that with the work that we've done and looking at these different indexes and data sets that we're trying to compile, that we will be in a position to implement some strategy for fall regulations, you know, and have, importantly, have the system in place to be able to track how that affects the population over time and react accordingly. That's my goal. And I think we're there. I have a little bit more work to do, as I've said. I still want to dig into the hunter or the harvest per hunter distribution or hunter density. I think that's going to be critical. And the damage and nuisance complaint database is also another metric that we need to get plugged in here. With those two things coming online and what I presented here tonight, I feel like we're in a good position to start really digging into the analysis of the data that we've collected at a granular level to try to make sense of those differences in WMUs, what pops out here and what you know, falls off the radar there, and to start looking at trends so we can move forward. And that is all that I have. So I will happily take questions. If anyone has it?
I do have a question.
Yeah.
So going back to, you were talking earlier about how some people were wanting to change the spring turkey rules in regard to going all day instead of just until noon. Wouldn't that give the toms an unfair advantage? Being that the hens typically start going back to the nest more so in the afternoon. So then the toms are just kind of wandering about on their own.
Hunting them in the afternoon, giving them an unfair advantage.
Yes, like if you were to extend it all day long.
I don't know if that plays out. We have one data set to look at. That's the youth season. They can hunt all day. And I've tracked that very closely. In fact, it's a graph in the harvest report. And, I think my experience with hunting is as you get further away from sunrise, the activity and your opportunity to harvest the tom goes down. That's not to say that you can't harvest them in the afternoon. You certainly can, and youths do. But I think you'll find that the vast majority of birds are in the morning. I think that's where there's the roost, the goblins hit the ground, they're looking around. That's when you can get them off the hook.
Interesting. I was just like observations with, you know, scouting and hunting. It just seems like the hens typically will go back to their nest in the afternoon. And when the hens aren't on their nest, that's when the toms and jigs are like hanging out with them.
Right, they're also hard to pull away from them. That's what
Yeah,
you're saying.
oh, definitely. I'm saying that if they're not with the hens in the afternoon, it's gonna give the male birds an unfair advantage because they might be more apt to just come right in.
You know, I'll be honest, I have not heard that, you know, put forth. I don't know that it's, you know, has bearing one way or the other, honestly. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that, David?
No, I'm just thinking hunter effort. I see a big drop off in the day of hunter effort, and that may be affecting what's going on.
Well, probably driving more than anything, just hunter effort. You know, I come in.
I usually get my bird at like 11:42, so.
Yeah, I think, Jamie, your comment has a lot of merit. I gotta tell you, I think most hunters have had it by 8 o'clock in the morning. There's a few people maybe like you, but I will say after doing this I'd be interested to hear Marty's comment because he's done her turkey hunting a long time. I've been hunting turkeys a long time, calling an awful lot of birds when I get out there, but 11 o'clock, so 12 is the most deadliest time period for
I've
me.
actually
So-
noticed this year that like I feel like most people are getting, or the toms have been most active between 12 and noon, or sorry, 10 and noon.
Yeah, yeah,
And I
yeah.
don't know
but
if
the-
anybody else has experienced this year, but I have not heard any birds talking this year.
Quiet, really
Yeah.
quiet.
Very quiet.
But what Chris should point out in our surveys on people's thinking on turkey hunting, I would hate to change what we have right now for spring hunting. What's the satisfaction rate, Chris? It's like in the 90s.
94%.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, that's off the chart. Show that for me for any other satisfaction for hunting, and we can all rest on our laurels.
What kind of damage situations do you get reported? That's not something I'm familiar with.
Yeah,
Is-
well,
is-
oddly enough, I text string with David last night, where an acquaintance of his was complaining about having hit a turkey and it goes through the front windshield and brought it to the local shop, St. Albans, I think he said, where the shop keeper said that was the 6th turkey in 10 days that they've had to fall out of the windshield.
I got one last year with no windshield.
Yeah, but they can be a pest in a lot of ways. I think that's. But they can be problematic for people. I've had them in my blueberry patch. I had one, I think it was in Bakersfield, one man who was exasperated blueberry farmer who just could not figure out how to keep the turkeys from decimating his crop. And it was a significant issue. I've had orchard keepers, apples and everything else. Turkeys are a problem. Farmers with silage, I mean, turkey flock that gets hooked on a silage bunker can actually spoil a lot by defecating in the bunker. There's a lot of issues. And then, so that's damage, but then there's nuisance. And so I have the ability of working with my colleagues in other states to take a peek at what's going on around us in more suburbanized states, which, let's face it, Vermont is moving in that direction with every day, right? That's progress. But like in Massachusetts, people are terrified by turkeys in places. And I'm not trying to like instill fear in any way in this metric, but we want to avoid that. Certain, turkeys that become aggressive. We've had, I think the woman was in Rutland recently or not recently, it was a couple of years ago now, but where she had a tom who was aggressively attacking its own reflection in the park. And again,
Yeah.
to the cost of thousands of dollars of paint, and dents. And she didn't know what to do. It's like, well, park it in your garage. She didn't have a garage. It wasn't that simple, unfortunately. But yeah, there's a whole host of issues. And I think it's important to note that right now, I don't have a good data stream on that. I don't believe that we have a damage or nuisance problem now. Because if there was a significant problem, I'd be hearing about it way more than I am. But the second part of that is that I want to be prepared for that in our future as climate changes, as hunter numbers maybe decline, as our state becomes more suburbanized. There's a whole number of factors. We've seen this with bear. Bear had, like in a matter of a few years, have become very hard to manage in that respect, where they were much easier not that long ago. So things can change, and I want to have our ducks in a row so that we know how to react and can react accordingly and appropriately.
Yes, some of us have been around long enough. We've seen the turkey population explode in numbers and geography. You said every town now harvests turkeys. We've run into birds. I know everybody else, in places you would never think a turkey would be, like in the Nulhegan Basin or the top of an Adirondack mountain. Are we seeing these birds evolve before our eyes and becoming adaptable to these northern regions?
Right. It's hard to say. Are they evolving to become more adaptable? I think they are adaptable species.
So we're at the northern range of turkeys, right? They don't go much further, but it seems like they survive winters. You would never think they could.
Yeah, I think there's maybe two things going on, and I'm speculating, but I think we have a changing condition, right? So, it's not as limiting to them as maybe had been in the past.
Yeah.
You're talking like pre-colonial distribution compared to today. It's very different. And I think there is probably some adaptation, about habitats they use. And, I don't know whether they're evolving to become more adaptable. I don't know, but I do know that they are adaptable. Clearly, they have taken advantage of this landscape in every habitat in it. That's pretty clear. I don't feel like I answered that very well, but.
No, you did.
Else?
I'll give a comment.
Yeah.
I met guys from Mississippi, North Carolina, Ohio, and Virginia, and they say this is one of the best turkey hunting states they've been in.
In Vermont.
Yeah. Just because you don't know the pressure, they said, compared to everywhere else.
Yeah, and I actually have heard that from a number of other folks. I get a lot of calls from Georgia hunters, Mississippi hunters, Tennessee. Yeah, and I ask any hunter that calls, particularly those from out of state that are coming here to hunt, I ask, for them to let me know how you did. I don't hear back from most, but I do hear back from a few, and they're typically like, right on, great state, Tom. And that's,
They're happy.
they're happy, yeah, it's a great state. Vermont's a beautiful state, on it, other than the ticks.
Yeah.
They have ticks and other things down there too. Well, thank you. Unless there's another-
One more quick question. Are there any relationships or correlations, whatever, between turkeys and deer in terms of where they might feed and where they might, you know, I mean, that, when you talked about the comments that you might hear.
Yeah.
I thought one of them was going to be the impact or the relationship it has with the deer herd.
Right.
And, you know, hunters say those darn turkeys.
Yeah.
You know, they moved in and the deer are gone, or not so much now, but historically, I think we heard that more.
Yeah, you definitely don't hear that as much anymore. And I think people realize that that's just not the case. There are other factors in the landscape that dictate these species' success and their distribution. They do share habitat. They always have. They share the resources out there. So, but to suggest that turkeys are impacting deer, I mean, I, as the Upland Game Bird Project, would say deer are impacting turkeys. You hear that, Nick? Yeah, it just doesn't play out in reality the way that it works in the landscape. There are other factors which really dictate those populations.
In the same vein as Brad's question, what about competition between turkeys and ruffed grouse and nesting areas?
Oh, they're very different in their behavior. So they utilize the same sort of forest, they utilize the same sort of cover for nesting, but they're partitioned on the landscape quite different, right? So you're talking of your grouse and like early successional, centered around early successional, sometimes, you know, conifer, you know, forest mixes. That's where their strongholds are. And I think that turkeys, that's not where their strongholds are. And I just don't think that nesting habitat is a limiting factor here in Vermont. I mean, that's the bottom line. Even if they were in the exact same habitat, competing for nesting habitat, there's plenty of nesting habitat out there. Vermont's largely forested. You know, there's a lot of brushy fields. There's a lot of shrubby edges to the field. There's a lot of, you know, forests, structural diversity. There's plenty of habitat for them to not compete with each other. I mean, at least I've never seen any indication, either in literature or from any of my colleagues in our discussions, that there was any concern of that kind of competition that would impact the population, change the population. Awesome. Well, thank you.
Thank you. No, thank you. Very, very helpful. Okay, next item on the agenda is the commissioner's updates.
Just want to acknowledge the great work, Chris. Thank you, dude. So I'll just mention that number of our biologists have been doing a lot of work with regard to projects that could or are threatening some of our threatened and endangered species. I won't mention exactly where, but it is occupying a fair amount of time. Folks going out, doing site visits, working with other agencies on development of the land to make sure that these rare and endangered species remain on the landscape. As far as the budget goes, while it has passed the legislature, doesn't have the governor's signature yet. And I'm not entirely sure how that's going to go. I'm not going to speculate, but at some point we expect there will be a budget. And highlights of that are we did get a good chunk of money to take care of some repairs that are needed at Buckley. On the camps. Also allows us to do some work on the buildings that we utilize to maintain our WMAs, some of the infrastructure and some work at the fish culture stations. Let me just see. There's also, I think I mentioned this here, we had asked for some one-time funding due to a claim that we saw for $200,000 of crop damage done by deer. The legislature put in 150,000. We have located the other 50 in our operating budget. Actually, it came out of our administrative budget. But one other piece that Catherine and I spent a fair amount of time working in the State House on is we got them to put in the big bill a limit of $5,000 per occurrence, so that we won't see a $200,000 bill like that again. We're still going to go back and look at that piece of legislation, which was passed in 1969, and work with the Ag Committee about updating it and finding somebody else to be responsible for that. I would let you know that Elizabeth Stratton has been promoted to be the director of the business office. She's been with the department for a while. She was functioning as the deputy director. The Thomas moved on to a different position, and so I was happy to promote her. She's well-versed, very skilled, and will do a fantastic job. And then the last thing I'd like to mention, you may have seen them in the news, but this is an indication of some success. The first is the lake trout population. And I don't know if Margaret, if I get this anyway wrong, you can correct me. But in Lake Champlain, because of the great work that we've seen, the cooperative effort between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the New York DEC, and our folks on controlling sea lampreys, we're seeing an increase on the wild trout, lake trout population and their ability to reproduce. That's a good thing. And so as a result, we will be looking to reduce the number that we are stocking into the lake. So there'll be more wild lake trout. The other is, for the first time in a number of years, we've added the Lamoille River to walleye stocking. That happened this year. And so they'll be part of that 5-year rotation. So I think that's a good piece of work by the fisheries division.
And make one correction there. So
I knew you would.
So the walleye, the 3 rivers, the Poultney, Winooski, and Missisquoi alternate on a 3-year cycle. This year we added Lamoille because the numbers have been down based on angler reports and everything. So we kind of doubled up. So what we do, we take the walleye, strip the eggs, raise them at Edweed, stock them back out. So the Poultney River are going to go back out. So we're hoping for more than a week, but we did those a week apart, which Edweed was able to do it. It was a scramble. But that Lamoille River will likely be on a 4, 5, or 6. It might be a 6-year cycle. It's not going to go on that 3-year cycle because we're going to be looking at the potential impact of that stocking rotation on potential for wild reproduction, because walleye numbers tend to fluctuate. So, and 3-year-olds is about the first age that they reproduce. So by extending that on the Lamoille, we might give a little more incentive for, or a better way to understand if we're limiting that 3-year-old reproduction or if it's really a population issue. So it allows us to kind of look at what we're doing on the other 3 systems.
Thanks for that. And I think I conflated when I said 4-year. I was actually thinking of the Lampricide treatment.
Excuse me, who was that just spoke? Not you, Commissioner, the fishery.
Margaret Murphy, the fish program manager.
And I should mention that for the first time I'm aware of, the Endangered Species Committee approved the permit request for Lampricide this year. So that's a good thing. And then one last thing I'll mention is I went up to go back about a month ago to Notre Dame. What's the name of the town? I can't think of it. It's a little town, a sleepy town up there. And Quebec doesn't allow the use of pesticides.
The Morpion barrier.
Yeah, the name of the town is, it's Notre Dame to something, I can't remember it. Anyway, I went up and they were celebrating the 10th year of a physical barrier that the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission paid for, and in conjunction with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And they put this thing in the spring with a crane. It goes in 3 sections. And it screens out, and it doesn't allow the lamprey to go upstream where they need to spawn. And so it has significantly reduced the sea lamprey there. So they had a celebration up there, and it was a nice thing, but it was cool to see in person. I mean, I'm like, this is a good, I'm gonna bring somebody up there to show it off. I think it's kind of cool. It's a neat little town too. So that's another success story. It's showing that cooperative effort though with Quebec, New York, and Vermont on trying to protect the fishery in Lake Champlain. So with that, I'll answer any other questions.
I have a quick question. The public hearings for trapping and hunting coyotes with dogs, those are scheduled for June 20th in Rutland, June 21st in Montpelier, and then June 22nd online. Do we have a sense yet of what kind of structure those meetings going to be held in? And
I'll let Mark deal with that.
Yeah, and David's been working on it, so please comment, David, but the structure is going to be very similar to how we've done other public hearings. So we're going to present briefly on the information to the folks, and then we will break out into groups and try to get information from everybody on how they feel, to get their input. So that's the structure. The virtual meeting won't be structured that way, but they will have a recording of the same presentation that are at the 2 live hearings, and we will pose the questions to everybody that's involved in the virtual meeting. And then, if for some reason we'll know how many people are tuned in, and if there's over 100 or so, we'll ask them if they keep their response to our questions to 2 or 3 minutes, but so everybody can have a chance to speak.
Just a reminder, we're collecting written responses.
Yep.
And the June 21st would normally be our June meeting. Is that canceled?
There's nothing scheduled for June meeting. So we're going to need all hands on deck to facilitate these meetings, because there's going to be a lot of, if we have large attendance, so I'm hoping board members will show up in earnest, and we anticipate having a lot of staff to be participating as well.
thank you. Any other questions for the commissioner or Mark? The department?
Just a comment. It's fun as an insurance agent. It's fun to see the state provide a policy to provide coverage for crop damage, have a big claim, and then react like an insurance company and say, "Oh, wait, no, never mind. Let's limit that."
Well, it's funny you say that, because I made the comment that we shouldn't be the insurance agent for what wildlife does. And somebody made the point, well, you're responsible for managing wildlife. I said, I think you misunderstand what managing wildlife is. We don't manage them by one animal at a time. And it was an interesting discussion, but they actually talked about us underwriting. And I said, I think there's a program for farmers for that. And the reality is, it costs a fair amount of money to buy that premium.
Yeah.
And so let me ask you this, as an insurance agent.
I'll write a lot of farms.
Doesn't matter. If I said to you, I can pay you X amount of dollars a year for insurance on my home, or I can just not and have somebody else pay for the damage for free, which would I do? And so puts us in a very untenable position.
Yeah.
But thank you for your recognition of that.
Okay, anything around the table? Anybody like to add anything?
I just had one. I had somebody in my area, asked about the free fishing day, which comes up in June 10th.
Yeah.
And his suggestion was that it be later in the month because virtually every high school in Vermont has graduation day on June 10th. And there's a lot of family celebrations, and he just felt that it was limiting the potential for a lot of folks to enjoy that day. They weren't licensed. It probably not that much of an impact because most people who enjoy fishing have licenses and fish. But
Well, that's what I was gonna say, but I will tell you, I went up to Grand Isle. I lived there. But I moseyed over to the fish hatchery last year. There were 400 people there,
wow,
right? And it was unbelievable. See, and it was 400 people, families, and I watched, the coolest thing that I saw, aside, you know, it was just, the whole event is really cool. If you haven't been as a board, you should go see. I mean, the wardens have a display there. They have people teaching you how to tie line, how to fly cast. They have walleye that's fried, which is my favorite part, except for this one thing. And there was a kid, he's probably about this tall, and he was walking out with a fish that was almost as tall as him, and the smile was so huge. And this is what it's all about.
Yeah.
And he was proud as could be, and everyone he walked by was like, "Oh my God, did you catch that by yourself?" And of course he didn't, because he would have been in the middle of the pond. He was so excited. And, some of those fish are left over from previous years, so they get pretty big. Even you could even catch one.
I've got a family graduation party to go to that.
Well, see, buy a license. I had somebody ask me if we'd let them fish in the pond on a different day. There are lots of places. We'll take that under advisement.
David, anything from you online?
No, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Well, before we have a motion to adjourn, I'd just like to thank the department for great presentations. Very informative, as always. And
Thank you.
great job for the whole department. Thank you.
I'd like to mention that Abigail, yet again, what did you make for dinner tonight? What kind?
Oh.
Leave with the venison. So thank you to Abigail for the time.
Okay, motion to adjourn.
So made.
Second.
Second.
Aye.
All right, meeting adjourned.
Oh. My two windows.